Hello, Maria.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your research. I'm really interested in finding out a little bit more about your project. I'll ask you just to introduce yourself, if you could, before we begin.
Yeah, hi. My name is Maria Cable, and I have been a nurse academic for 22 years. And for a long time, my role was teaching cancer nursing. And I eventually found myself running a niche program in adolescents and young adults with cancer. So that was the start of a new specialism. And we recognize that the needs of teenagers and adolescents are very different to adults and children. And a huge part of that is educating our workforce on what that is. And being a cancer nurse myself, I'm interested in the work of nurses. So when I had the opportunity to undertake a doctorate, that's what I wanted to explore, was the experience of early career nurses looking after adolescents and young adults with cancer. So some very quite specific things in there that took me a long time to nail down. But I've been in research in other ways apart from my doctorate, and be that as being involved in literature reviews or running other kinds of projects. But this one was one that I've lived with for 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, lived with is an interesting choice of phrase. I've definitely had that experience when I was doing my PhD. Wake up with it at 3 in the morning. Yeah, it's an intense experience, and it's an interesting choice of focus because it sounds kind of quite clearly boundaried there. You've got that idea about children either transitioning into that in-between stage or of being diagnosed while they're kind of betwixt and between the services. And
yeah, well, that's a totally different lecture, why their needs are so different. But in terms of the doctorate, I think because I got so involved in the specialism which was emerging, and we were trying to determine, well, is it a new specialism and why is it a new specialism? And during my doctoral thinking, I was introduced to different concepts, things that I'd never heard of as a nurse before, such as FOCO, and I began to look at where power sat in and around this developing specialism, and that kind of really intrigued me because I'd never been exposed to that kind of thinking before. I didn't think I was capable of it, I'll be honest, but actually when I began to read it and engage with others who understand it, it began to make a bit more sense. So but I still wanted to be really grounded as a nurse. And the age group that we look after in teenage and young adult cancer care, TYA, or AYA as it's internationally known, adolescent and young adult cancer, in the UK is 15 to 24. So we will have units, 28 units around the UK where these young people will be cared for, but only about 50% of them go there. The rest are treated either in paediatric or adult centres. That's a totally different conversation. But for me, I wanted to come back and look at early career nurses. So I could have looked at any nurse, but the experiences of a clinical nurse specialist looking after them as compared to an early career nurse, to my mind, would be very different. And I knew that these early career nurses would be newly qualified, that many of them would be a similar age to the patients. I figured that would probably be quite likely. And they're the ones who are at the bedside day in, day out, whereas the clinical nurse specialists they go to clinics, they see their work is very different. So I wanted to explore, the experiences of early career nurses working in specialist settings who look after adolescent and young adult cancer nurses. So it took me a long time to get that question narrowed. So if you were to look at my application for my doctorate, I was looking at the emotional impact because we figured this was going to be an issue. And then that evolved over time, and I wanted to know, I was making an assumption that there was a big emotional issue there. So I didn't want to do that either. I wanted to know about the broad experience. So working through my studies, and I did a professional doctorate where I was exposed to 8 different modules that looked at things from very different lenses. And I had insight into qualitative research, quantitative systems thinking, theoretical concepts. I began to determine my question on what I wanted to look at. And yes, emotion did come up in the findings, but it wasn't what I started out with. And I guess that's what happens when you work in teams, and you work with supervisors and you work with other researchers who help you shape your thinking and shape your question.
I suppose it kind of keeps you, it keeps you from going down a kind of cognitive bias route and saying, I am looking for this thing and only this thing, so I won't notice all these other interesting things that are alongside it. So broadening it out to their general experiences, supported by your team.
Yeah, and you could go looking for something very specific, and that keeps your project very neat and very narrow. And sometimes that's what happens when you're applying for research bids. You're asked to look at something very specific, so you do that, and you have to think about how you do that. But for me, I was given the opportunity to look at something broadly, and I wanted something that was going to be meaningful to these newly qualified nurses or early career nurses. And I had to think of my theoretical framework and also how I was going to do that. And I arrived,
I was just going to ask how you did actually decide on how to collect that data, like to sort of what your unit of analysis was.
So before that, we even had to think about what was my method and methodology, which was narrative inquiry. And narrative inquiry is about storytelling. And I wanted nurses to tell me about their story, so that I could hear their stories. It's their stories, not mine. And that was what was going to give me some insight into their experience. So it's my job then to manage that story and interpret it and do it justice.
Could you tell me a little bit more about narrative inquiry as a kind of method? So somebody tells you a story. What do you then actually, you talked about interpreting it. How do you actually kind of dive into that and interpret somebody else's experience in that way?
Yeah, so narrative inquiry is something that's become more written about and more mainstream, I think, in the past 10 or 15 years. And you have to think narratively from the start. So when you think of a story, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you could look at it from the beginning, the middle, and an end. And usually you might look at things like emplotment. What was the plot and who were the main characters? But I didn't want to go down that road. I wanted to hear their stories. And during my interviewing, I had a loose structure as to what I wanted them to tell me about. And they knew I was going to interview them for about 45 minutes, maybe to an hour and a half. I had to open the conversation, and I had to get to a middle, and I had to get to an end. But when they told me something, I had to follow that theme or follow that nugget of information as it was. So it was up to me to find it and go back to it. So I had to really be in tune with what they were telling me and say, tell me a little bit more about that. So I wasn't looking for something specifically. I could have gone looking for the emotional impact of it, but it appeared itself. I didn't have to go looking for it.
So that kind of implies incredibly active listening if in the process of containing the interview, keeping track of time, thinking about your schedule, you also are having to pay attention to those probably quite subtle little nuggets, like you say, to kind of follow them to see where they go. So quite a skillful activity.
And I think because I'm a cancer nurse and I've been teaching communication skills, I had to be really in tune with that. And I also had to be really in tune with the fact that they were going to be telling me stuff. I had to make them feel safe to tell me, because actually, in order to tell your story where you might be vulnerable in that, you have to feel safe. Yeah. So I wanted my participants to feel that.
Yeah. Otherwise, I would imagine, would tell you what they think you want to hear. So
yeah, and the thing with stories is, the story I'll tell you today might be slightly different to the story I'll tell you tomorrow. So in research terms, that sometimes feels like slippery ground, but it's their story, and stories are remembered long after facts.
That's a really valuable point. I think they're so much more powerful sometimes, especially for a topic like this, where you kind of won't be able to necessarily relate to, I don't know, a Likert scale of how confident somebody feels on how to look after children. young adults.
And what I saw were stories within stories. So if I were to look at my transcript of each interview, that I didn't call them interviews in the end, I called them storied conversations. There were stories within stories. So you would find, oh, I remember when this happened, or I said, can you tell me about a patient that's really memorable for you, and why is that memorable? So you would have a story within that, and then you would have a story about maybe how they managed things when they left work.
Yes, yes.
And then how their own family helped them do their job.
Yeah, but that's wonderful, because that's how we live. It is our reality.
Yeah. So
amazing.
I had a lot of rich data, and I remember.
How did you must have had absolutely loads to work on. How did you kind of make sense of that, and how did you approach the analysis?
Right, so I'm dyslexic, so my brain thinks very differently, and I see patterns quite clearly sometimes and not at other times. My data, I collected my data during the pandemic, and the ethics of this took me over a year to get ethical approval. I wanted to go into 4 hospitals in England, and it took me more than a year to get ethical approval to do that. I got ethical approval on February 2020, and we had the pandemic in the March, so it was non-essential research. So I had to rewrite my recruitment strategy. So I recruited via social media, a bit like you did, to try and get people to participate in this. And I had 9 nurses come forward, and we ended up having to do all of our interviews on Zoom. So that recorded it for me, which was brilliant. So I had something to work with. My dyslexic brain meant that I could go back and watch these interviews. That was really, really helpful and really powerful. Obviously, I've had to manage the data and the ethics of all of that. So I had transcripts which I had to clean up. You have to make sure that you make them as accurate as possible. They went back to all of the participants. And then I used something called NVivo to try and help me, for no other reason, see it clearly rather than my scribbled handwriting. So I knew, but I really used that as a management tool rather than an analytical tool, although I did teach myself to use that to help me look for themes. So you start off looking, so you read it and you find this is interesting, and this could be related to that. So I ended up starting out with 56 codes. And then I narrowed that, and I began to put them together, and all with my supervisors, and I arrived, I think, at 9.
Okay.
So that was quite an iterative process, and there were times when I would print out those codes, and I would work in this room, and I had a massive post-it note with post-it notes on them. So it became quite a physical thing for me as well. So they were legible because they were printed out as opposed to my handwritten notes. So I became quite tactile with it, but it was contained, and I began to use a part of NVivo called a framework matrix, and that helped me. Oh, where did this appear and where did that appear? So I could look within my data and through the data, if you know what I mean. And I can't even believe I'm saying that, because I never thought I would do a doctorate or I'd be a researcher, but these things happen when you least expect them to. So another really sticky point, or thing that challenged me really, was to try to think about what's your theoretical framework. Well, it took me quite a while to get my head around what the hell do you mean by theoretical framework.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I determined I could have looked at lots of theoretical frameworks, and they're kind of like a coat hanger where you would hang things. Well, I'm going to look at this theory says X, Y, and Z, so I'll go and look for X, Y, and Z in my data. But I didn't really want to do that, because this method didn't really lend itself to that. I wanted it to tell me something. So I arrived at the conclusion that I was a postmodern thinker. So when you
having been given a clue to that by the number of printouts you'd cut up and rearranged and aggregated.
So I couldn't categorically say I am a social constructivist, I'm an ethnographer. That's not me. I had to think about me and and also I had to think about what I was looking to explore and what it lent itself to. I'm not a quantitative researcher, so there was no way a randomized controlled study was going to tell me what I needed to know from these nurses. and would never have been an appropriate methodology for trying to establish an answer to my question. So I decided that I was a postmodern thinker, which kind of leaves things open. I respect theory. I looked at theories, many different theories, and I had to make some big decisions as to what lent itself to my work. So I wasn't atheoretical, but I had to think about how I could integrate and weave theory within my doctorate. And I had to make that really clear throughout. And at the end, I came up with narrowed my codes, as I said, but then I had to look at what were the themes in relation to some of the theoretical principles that were around, and actually what was new and what was novel, because the whole reason you do a doctoral piece of work is to try and answer a question that's not been asked before, because otherwise you wouldn't do it. So I arrived at some new thinking that hadn't appeared before about these early career nurses. So the emotion of it all was a big part of it. And it wasn't just how tricky it was for them, but actually we looked at the joy of this work that was involved, looked at the sadness. The massive thing for them was managing complexity, the expectation that they as Band 5 nurses were managing huge clinical complexity on their own, particularly at nights and at weekends, massive clinical complexity, having to function differently from room to room, with young person to young person, and extreme. When you look at the emotions, they might be in having a game of pool in the day room, which is a very integral part of that, to then telling a young person that they're going to die, to then having to move to the next room where somebody's due to chemo. So the range of emotions was huge. But age is a big issue for us in teenage and young adult cancer care, 15 to 24. But these nurses, some of them, 8 of the 9 nurses I interviewed were 28 or less. So their age, the age mattered. It wasn't just the age of patients, but the age of the nurses. So that gave me an opportunity to unpick some of that. So yeah, it grew its own legs. But I had to look for the newness, what was new within this. But their age came up quite a bit during our interview, so I hung on to that theme or that thread throughout them all, and the fact that they were early career, that I had to remember that, and many of them were as young as the patients, and we think of adolescents and their developing brain, and I think if you're looking at a newly qualified nurse who could be 22, their brain's developing too, yet they're the ones giving the chemotherapy and trying to manage families and work with patients their own age.
Absolutely. And we know that that whole kind of empathic response is so much more profound if it's somebody whose shoes you could imagine yourself in. And I think it's a really interesting fact. So that the age connection and the complexity sounds like they were 2 of the really important findings. Were there any others that you haven't mentioned already?
Well, I ended up developing a conceptual framework of AYA cancer nursing based on what I found from these nurses. Now, these were early career nurses. I have been involved in a research project before, a couple of research projects, one that I led on and one that I participated in, where we developed competence frameworks for nurses or other people who are working in this field of care. So I proposed a new conceptual framework that's there for further development when we share this. And it's my job now to try and disseminate my research, and this is one opportunity to do that. And of course, the other one will be presenting at conferences or getting a paper out. And I have written one about Michelle Foucault, actually. If you want to Google that one, you'll find it. It's a nurse inquiry. Just if you're interested in that, and just see where that took me on places that I hadn't really considered before. But anyway, so I ended up looking at some of this was about management and leadership of these units and looking after these staff, because if they're as young as the patients and they are our early career nurses, with the global shortage at the minute, we need to look after them. And sometimes it's not just about putting in clinical supervision or Schwartz rounds, or any number of things, which is where emotion probably would have taken me. It's about checking in on people and not assuming that everyone is okay, or actually leaving a shift when there's been something very traumatic, and then you might be back for 4 or 5 days. When you're then left, you go home and you linger with that, and your family don't know what to do with you, because that's what happens.
Yeah.
So there's a bit on that. There's a bit on education as training and development. So all of these young nurses had aspirations to become a clinical nurse specialist. It was almost like it was something they had to do. To do this band 5 work, and they very much, I think I aligned them with a Sherpa. They were there, they walked with these young people along the way, but my goodness, were they carrying a load, a huge load and huge responsibility at such a young age, really. So that became an issue. The age, and boundaries, professional practice, professional development, that became an issue, because it can be a challenge when you're working with that intensity day in, day out, and particularly during the pandemic, where many of them, well, young people weren't allowed visitors, so these nurses were there constant.
They were there, everything. They were their families.
So I began then to build on a conceptual framework that Sarah Lee had done as part of another study called the Bright Light Study, a part of her doctoral work. She was a nurse, and she looked at the concept of AYA cancer care, and I then tried to apply my findings to develop a conceptual framework of AYA cancer care nursing.
Right. I could listen to you talk about your project all day. It sounds so fascinating. I'm really aware of time, and I think what I'd like to do, with your permission, is to provide links to the publication that you mentioned, the one in Nurse Inquiry, anything else that you think would be of interest to read around the findings. I think it will have such resonance with kind of about to qualify nurses, because I think regardless of which field you go into, there is that real kind of sense of responsibility and suddenly being out in the world. But I think you've chosen a population that almost, I suppose, one of the most challenging populations to be able to embark on as a relatively newly qualified nurse. So I would really love to be able to provide those papers for people to read a little more about it. Is there anything that you want to add before we stop the recording? Perhaps around how embarking on this might have changed your thoughts about the usefulness of research in the real world, or that's a totally leading question.
Nope. I think if I think to how I was when I was a newly qualified nurse, research to me was one of those things you just had to learn about enough to pass your course, if I'm totally honest. But that and ethics, a couple of those things, kind of like, we know they're important, but in my day-to-day work, I cannot see how that matters to me. And as I've had a very divergent career path, and maybe, I don't think it's an age thing, I don't know what it is, but it really does matter more than you think. And it's often quite a scary thing. And research doesn't have to be doing a doctorate, which is something I didn't think I would ever do, but you can be involved in research, and clinical research, collecting data for people on clinical trials. You could be part of a project team, even doing your project for your specialists. And some of my students did projects just like your students will be doing. And they might have been starting to gather literature, evidence around a question that's not really been explored before. And then they'll find a spark and they think, well, maybe I'll explore that more, either through working with the practice development team at work, working with the research team in a university. You might get a really good mark on your assignment, and somebody like Laura might help you say, well, that's probably there might be a paper on that. And before you know it, you kind of think, actually, this is how we advance the world in which we live in. And I've been really lucky to contribute in different ways. And in some ways, nursing's been behind But research is research. It's not just nursing research. You're doing research, whether you're a nurse or whether you're an OT or a physio or a doctor or whatever. But it matters, and you can make a huge difference just by doing a little and respecting and appreciating it. But don't be scared of it, because sometimes you won't have all the answers, and no one does. Even the professors that we work with, they don't have all the answers, and sometimes you just have to commit and make a decision about whatever the research is. I could have used many methodologies to try and answer my question. I could have looked at so many different things, but sometimes you just have to nail your idea to a post and just go with it, and you will come up with answers as long as other people help you validate them. But you can come up with some really unique things that really make a difference to whatever it is you're exploring, be it pressure sores or mucositis or safeguarding, whatever.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you giving up your time to produce this resource. It's been so fascinating hearing about your work. I'll stop the recording now. Thank you.
Thanks. Good luck, everyone.